Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I'm Simon from Scar Illustration, and I hope you're keeping well. Today's video is going to be about my process for the cover illustration for Magic Breaker by Marie Bilodeau, which is the second book in the Keepers of a Broken Land series. If you'd like to check out the video for the first book in this series, Oathbreaker, I'll leave a link in the description below. Let's dive in. Before I created this illustration, I sketched out a bunch of thumbnails and some color sketches, just so I could get the exact composition and look for the character. The author had given me a pretty good idea of what she was looking for, but I still like to do the preliminary work to make sure I've explored all the options. The author had also given me a brief description of the character and a rough sketch of her outfit. But I felt that it needed to be developed a bit further, so I went ahead and embellished certain areas for added interest. Then it was on to creating the final sketch. First up was to get a basic block in of all the local colors of the different elements. For this painting, that was a combination of using the lasso tool and filling the shapes, as well as painting with a large soft airbrush. I've recently started using the lasso tool a bit more in my workflow, as opposed to just using brushes, as it's fast, precise, and perfect for this stage of my painting process. I also added a suggestion of the light and shadow areas, as well as other atmospheric effects, so I have the basic building blocks in place. I spent a bit more time on the main character's outfit, roughing in all the folds and drapery, so as to get all of that in the right place from the get-go. I'm also checking my reference photos to make sure that the lighting and most of the main details are correct. Once the character was basically roughed in, I moved on to the background sky. I decided to use a somewhat busy cloud formation as I wanted to amp up the drama of the scene. As there's not a lot of action going on, I had to rely on other elements such as the sky, cape, atmospheric effects, and brushstrokes to convey a sense of movement. The floor symbols on the platform were taken from the color sketch, and you'll see a bit later on, I decided to simplify the shapes as I felt it was a bit too busy and most of the details were just getting lost. I also took the magic concept from the color sketch and then embellished it on the final painting. More on that later. Once that was done, it was time to tackle the face of the character. I like to get this and the hands at least partways done fairly early on, as they are the hardest to get right. But they are also the two areas that viewers will inadvertently look at straight away. I know that when I'm relatively happy with both the hands and the face, it'll make the whole process a bit easier in my mind. To start fleshing out the face, I simply added another layer on top, changed the blend mode to multiplied, and started to slowly add in the features with a soft brush using the same skin tone. I find this is a really quick way to describe things without getting into all the different color nuances straight away. Once the darker tones are roughed in, I then started to work on the lighter areas. I used to use a bunch of brushes when I was starting to paint faces, but now, when I'm getting started, I tend to just use the airbrush predominantly. And then when everything is in the right place, I'll go back in with other brushes to describe different textures, details, and planes of the face. For the hands, I used almost the same exact technique, except I'll start with a harder round brush and then progressively soften different areas. When I'm painting hands, I prefer to think of them as one big shape, and within that, smaller shapes and planes. That helps me to get the overall look without worrying about getting all the nooks and crannies exactly right straight away. Once I was somewhat happy with the hands, I moved on to the outfit. From a design perspective, the outfit was fairly straightforward, but getting the folds correct, especially on the skirt area, was definitely challenging. Real quick, if you enjoy the content, please consider liking the video and subscribing to my channel. The more support I have, the easier it'll be for me to continue to create videos for the channel. Now back to the video. After the character was half done, it was time to move on to other areas of the painting. I started with the sky. I never used to enjoy painting clouds, but now I see them as an interesting challenge and an element that can really help set the mood of an illustration. These storm clouds were pretty dramatic, and I had a lot of fun painting them. As there's so many different areas to these clouds, I spent most of the time zoomed out so I could see how everything was working together. Then it was on to the background keep and the surrounding hills. Background architectural elements are one of those things where the structure or silhouette has to be correct, or it just won't be believable. That's not to say that getting the details right isn't important, but for this painting, as the keep was in the distance, it was more important that the quick read or silhouette was right. To begin with, I tried painting everything in, but it just wasn't looking right. A lot of the edges were looking way too fuzzy, so I went back over it with the lasso and marquee tool to tighten things up, and then used Gaussian blur to make sure the edges weren't too sharp or digital looking. Next, it was on to the foreground elements, and I started with the pillars. I sourced a number of different reference photos for these, but I still kind of struggled to get them to look how they were in my head. For quite a while, they just seemed to look a bit too cartoony or not realistic enough. And again, I didn't want to go too overboard with the details, so as to take away interest from the main character. Then it was on to the magic floor symbols. I had already roughly worked out how I wanted the magic effect to look on the color sketch, so it was just a case of going through the same procedure and developing them a bit further. I also added some dust to suggest movement and energy. Once that was roughed in, it was time to go back to the main character for final details and polish. As there were no character accessories described in the rough sketch from the author, I decided to try a few things to see how they'd look. I had a pretty good idea who the character was from reading one of the books, and knew that she most likely wouldn't be dripping in jewelry. So I started with some basics: a ring, earrings, and the bracelets. To tie all of the accessories together, I included a circular shape wherever possible. I also continued with this theme on the belt and the cape. When I was doing those, I experimented with changing the color of her casting hand. I ended up with a blue color and, liking the effect, decided to keep it. When I'm painting metal elements, such as the belt and bracelets, I like to start out with a mid-tone gray shape. I'll then slowly go over that with the burn tool for the shadows and dodge tool for the highlights. I found that these give me the right tonal range and high specularity for metal. After that, I'll typically go back over them with a textured brush so as to give them a more real-world look. Next, he was onto all the folds and drapery of the main character's outfit, as well as adding more contrast to give the impression of 3D form. I also darkened the bottom of the outfit to suggest the light fall off as it moves down the figure. Then I went back to the floor symbols. As you can see, I duplicated the circular shape, simplified the overall design, and replaced the original motif. I then adjusted some of the background mist to give it a bit more shape and definition, added some weathered details to the foreground stairs, and made some quick adjustments to the cape. Then it was finally time to tackle the summoned magic area. To make it stand out a bit more, I darkened the clouds behind the magic first. I then started to trim some of the superfluous wisps of smoke, and also spent time adding more details to the smoke areas so as to make it look less airbrushy. I wanted the summoning hand to really stand out, and so I added a white ball surrounded by blue flames behind it. After resizing the magic as a whole, I then started bouncing around the entire painting, making subtle adjustments where needed. I ended up removing the shortest of the pillars, as it didn't seem to be working in the overall scheme of the painting. Whenever I'm working on a painting, I make sure not to become too married to any one element, in service of a better picture overall. I also softened up some of the edges on the main character, as they looked a bit too sharp. After that, I added some reflective lights to the main figure, so that she appears to be in the actual scene. One of the challenges of this illustration was making sure that the painting worked as a part of the Keepers of a Broken Land series, but was also a strong enough image to stand out on its own. It was also a challenge to create the character as the author had envisaged. I had a pretty good descriptive base to work from, but it's never a sure thing that both I and the author will have the same vision for the character. In the end, thankfully the author was really happy with the final painting, so it all worked out. Hope this was helpful, and let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. Please consider liking this video and subscribe to my channel. Have a good one, and keep on painting!